Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is Bloomberg Businessweek. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news. The Bloomberg Businessweek podcast with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec from Bloomberg Radio.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Bloomberg Businessweek Weekend Podcast. It's a holiday weekend thanks to the July 4th holiday. Many may be finding themselves on the beach, up in the mountains, in a nearby park, or sitting on their front stoop with some time on their hands.
So with that in mind, here's our team's summer reading list, in no particular order, and including books from a Nobel laureate and a former witch on Wall Street to one about sailing the high seas alone, to the journalist who's keeping track of those who break barriers later in life.
We begin with our team's pick by Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, professor of economics at Columbia University. He was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Clinton and a former chief economist of the World Bank.
He's written many books, authored numerous research papers on many aspects of economics, equality, and more. His latest subject matter is covered in a new book. It's called The Road to Freedom: Economics and the Good Society. Our conversation began with the Fed's commitment to that 2% inflation objective and whether a little above actually makes much of a difference. We spoke to Professor Stiglitz in late April.
From the point of view of economics, having 2.5% or even 3% inflation is not a big deal. You know, the 2% target was pulled out of thin air. It was not based on economic science. What we want to be sure of is that we don't have runaway inflation. And inflation has clearly been tamed. It's been brought down. It's stable. It fluctuates from month to month. But it is not a major problem. We should be focusing on other things, continuing economic growth, making sure that all Americans share in that growth. Those are the kinds of things that we ought to be thinking more about.
So, Professor Stiglitz, should the Fed abandon the 2% inflation goal? Should they have a different inflation goal, a different metric that they should be held accountable to?
Yes, I think they should. I think they should be talking about keeping it within a range, 2 to maybe 3.5%, 4%. You know, there's actually some economic science that says, especially in a time of major structural change, such as we're going through, having a little higher inflation actually is helpful in reallocating resources in the presence of downward nominal rigidities of wages. Because what guides the movement of resources from one place to another is relative wages. And if some wages are sticky downward, you want other wages to go up enough to move labor, and that means you're going to have more inflation. So actually, a little higher inflation is actually good for the economy.
Do you think the Fed's management of the economy has been a good one in terms of policy?
Quite frankly, no.
Okay.
To put it bluntly, let's go back to when inflation broke out after the pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The question was, what was the cause, the primary cause of the inflation? It was unambiguous. It was the pandemic and war-related interruptions in supply chains, rising prices caused by shortages of oil and food. It was demand shifts. People wanted to live in different places, and that meant housing prices went up where there was a scarcity, but didn't go down as much where there was where people didn't want to live, like in parts of New York. Raising interest rates actually impedes the ability of the economy to respond to that kind of structural, to that kind of challenge. We needed to build more houses in the places where there was a scarcity. And having higher interest rates actually makes it more difficult. They also have a model of the economy that's based on competition. That might have been true some time ago, but we have an economy with a lot of market power. And firms are trading off. If they raise their prices, they get more profits today. They lose profits in the future. And in that trade-off, when you raise the interest rate, they value those future losses less, and they're induced to raise their prices more. So margins go up. Mm-hmm. And a marked aspect of the inflation that we've just been through is that markets have increased enormously.
Hey, Professor Stieglitz, I just wanted to, speaking of the Fed, Carol, I know you had a.
Well, one thing before we have a bigger, broader question that's certainly been
Carol's
a big
eager
thing.
to jump in on this.
Well, but do you think then we should be cutting rates already, that we're behind the curve right now?
Yes, I think the risks are asymmetric. I think with Europe already slowing down in recession, we don't know where China is going to be going. I think prudence would have us going back to a more normal interest rate.
Yeah.
The higher interest rates are really not going to be taming inflation. The Fed model was wrong in another way. They dramatically had said that we're going to need 5% of inflation for 5% unemployment for some time in order to get inflation down. They were absolutely wrong. We got inflation down where in a period where we kept unemployment relatively low. So their analysis of the economy was just off. And meanwhile, they have put at risk our banking system. We had a problem in Silicon Valley Bank, partly because of the enormous changes in term structure, which their policies led to. And we're facing a debt crisis in the developing countries and emerging markets. So there's enormous one-sided risk, I believe, in the policies that they've been pursuing.
Well, on the Fed, Professor Stieglitz, I got to ask you about this Wall Street Journal report that broke last night that said how former Trump administration officials are coming up with plans to take on the independence of the Federal Reserve, essentially at one end of the spectrum, even allowing, if President Trump gets reelected, him to weigh in on Fed policy when it comes to interest rates. Talk a little bit about your reaction to if this were to come to fruition, how important the independence of the Fed is, and if that would really put at risk the model of the independence of the U.S. financial system.
Well, I think Trump is himself a major argument why you want to have independence of the Fed. You don't want somebody who doesn't understand monetary policy, who would put at risk the long-run stability of the economy for the short-term electoral advantage of having a hot economy right before an election. That's precisely why there is an argument for independence. So, I believe in accountability of the Fed. It is a public institution. We had previous chairman of the Fed were very cognizant of that. I remember Paul Volcker saying, Congress created us and Congress can uncreate us. So there is a kind of accountability that responsible heads of the Fed understand, but we certainly don't want Donald Trump to be running monetary policy.
All right, we do want to dig into your book because you've been thinking a lot about the meaning of freedom, and I think we throw the word around a lot. I think the folks who created the United States, our founding fathers, thought about freedom a lot. And the difference, though, between what that really means, and maybe it comes down to, as you think about it, the values that we all have in society. Tell us about how we need to kind of maybe redefine freedom and what it means in terms of citizens more broadly and generally, as well as economically in terms of their success.
Sure. I approach the issue, obviously, as an economist. Mm-hmm. And as an economist, we think of freedom is free to do what you can do. What are the choices that you can make? Somebody who is at the point of starvation doesn't really have any freedom. He has to do what he can to survive. And so expanding the set of choices that an individual is available is a way of saying that he has more freedom. And here there are a couple of ideas I put forward in my book. The first is that in our integrated urban 21st century economy, what one person does, the expansion of his freedom may lead to less freedom of others. Isaiah Berlin, the great Oxford philosopher, put it this way. He said, freedom for the wolves has often meant death for the sheep. And in the context of the U.S., for instance, the freedom to carry an AK-47 means that people will die. And it means that our school children are not free from fear. They have to learn what to do if a gunman comes into the classroom, and teachers have to go to school worried about whether they'll be attacked. Freedom not to wear masks is taking away the freedom of others to live. So we have to balance these freedoms. There are trade-offs. In many cases, those trade-offs are easy. Freedom to pollute takes away the freedom to have somebody with asthma to even live, let alone the freedom of all of us to live on our planet. So there, I think we have to constrain the freedom of the polluters and the freedom of the exploiters.
So we're talking with Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel laureate economist, professor of economics at Columbia University, and we're talking about his new book, The Road to Freedom, Economics in the Good Society. All right, so if we rethink, Professor Stiglitz, the idea of freedom, so it's maybe more inclusive or it's a broader definition, how do we do that within society with corporations? The need to be profitable for those. We're in earnings season. We look at companies and their reports, and that's how we kind of measure them, grade them. What does government need to do? How can we maybe be better, if you will, for more?
First, let me emphasize that in the world I've just described, there's an important role for regulations. Corporations often don't like that, but we have to remember the purpose of our economy is to improve the lives and livelihoods of our citizens. It's not the other way around, that the economy is supposed to serve society, not the other way around. There's another aspect. Regulations can actually expand the freedom of all of us. Think about stoplights. If we don't have stoplights, we have gridlock. None of us has the freedom to move. Stoplights, which are a little bit of coercion, mean that I have to take turns. But by taking turns, we all have more freedom. And that basic idea extends much more broadly. People don't like to pay taxes. They often feel a little kind of coercion. But when those tax revenues are used productively, like they were to invest in the internet and invest in the mRNA platform that led to the vaccine against COVID-19, that expands our freedom to do.
Right.
And so we have to look at this in a little bit more holistic way.
Well, I want to go to your taxes point, because I'm curious if you could wave a magic wand or implement some sort of tax policy here in the U.S. What would it be? How could you reinvent it? Would you broaden the tax base? Would you lean more on corporate taxes? Would you tax wealth more? What, in your opinion, would work?
Well, I begin by analyzing what are some of the key problems our society faces. And one of them is inequality. One of the reasons, and a second problem is the growth of market power, which has been enormous in the last few decades. And those two are obviously linked. When you have more market power, the fruits of that market power go to those at the top. We also have more, what economists call monopsony power. Mm-hmm. Firms have market power over workers and have driven down their wages significantly below a competitive level. So I want to have more antitrust policy, more competitive labor market policies, but that's going to take time. In the meanwhile, there's a lot of monopoly rents. And so part of what I would begin by doing is increasing corporate profits taxes, which are not a tax on return to capital. Mm-hmm. They are a tax on this monopoly profits. I'd also like to have environmental taxes. Firms that are engaged in polluting the environment ought to pay for the damage that they're doing. Remarkably, America, those at the top pay a lower percentage of their taxes than those down below. Even some of our richest people have commented that they think that's morally wrong.
Well, can I ask you, like on a day when we're looking at a company, and forgive me, I'm just singling out because it popped, shares of Alphabet are now a $2 trillion market cap company. This week, next week, last week, we've been obsessed with certainly what we call the Magnificent Seven, the big mega cap tech companies. They're very big. Amazon, we talked with an author recently, so entrenched certainly in our world, and you think about their reach. Are these the companies, the individuals, whether it's an Amazon, whether it's a Meta, whether it's an Alphabet, that you think, you talk about growth of market power, is it too much at this point, in your view, that something needs to be done to rein them in, or do the benefits outweigh the downside here?
Well, they do give benefits, but they have a lot of downsides. They need to be better regulated. Europe has done a better job at regulating them. The digital harms are quite obvious and have been by now well documented. But talking narrowly now about market power, I think we ought to do what we can to limit their market power, but tax the fruits of that market power, the revenues that they get, at a much higher rate. If you ask the question, would Jeff Bezos or the founders of Google or Zuckerberg stop working if we tax their wealth in a way, say, of 3%? And the answer is obvious. They would continue to work.
But do you think that they would leave the United States?
Well, we have imposed what we call an exit tax, that those with a lot of wealth and who don't feel loyalty to the United States can leave. We allow them to leave, but they have to pay a tax that represents a tax on the fruits of the wealth that they've accumulated while they've been in the United States. And that tax is significant and it is a deterrent. And if it's not, it may be that we ought to consider raising that tax. But I don't think people like Zuckerberg, Musk are going to leave the United States. They realize the benefits of American citizenship.
We're speaking right now with Professor Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel laureate economist. He's a professor of economics at Columbia University. He's got a new book out, The Road to Freedom, Economics and the Good Society. Professor, as I mentioned, you are up at Columbia. You've been there for a long time. We've been watching everything that's been happening on the campus there, as well as campuses including USC, Yale, MIT. The list continues to go on here in the United States as we've seen pro-Palestinian protests and encampments take over some of these campuses. Freedom in the academic context. How are you looking at the protests in the context of freedom of speech?
That's a good question. I mean, first let me comment that up at where my office is, which is the Manhattanville campus, things are very quiet.
Near the business school.
At the business school.
Yeah, quiet there.
But you've been on campus a long time, and you've seen different protests over the years, and it seemed to be, I was there when there were protests, and it seems like that's what students should be doing, exploring and pushing back when they don't feel like things are right. But what is it, those protests in the context of freedom of speech?
So I agree with you very strongly. I'm actually happy the students are engaged in the world. That's one of the things I try to get them to be interested in the world, and also to reason about the world, to come to understand it, and to debate how could or should things be changed. So that's a good thing. And in my own life, protests have played a very important role. Back in 1963, I was down there in the March on Washington with Martin Luther King. And, that speech he gave about I have a dream has been a lifelong inspiration to me. So even civil disobedience in certain circumstances can be an important mechanism for social change. We have a special responsibility, of course, to make sure on our campus that all views get heard, that we can have civil debates. And so on the one hand, academic freedom is really important. And I really took offense to Speaker Johnson coming up to our campus and calling for the resignation of our president. I hadn't seen anything like that, maybe since the HUAC hearings, the House Un-American Activities Committee back with McCarthy in the 50s. Wow. I mean, that kind of direct interference in academia is just unheard of. And we know some of the Republicans have been trying to undermine universities because universities teach children how to, our youngsters, our young men and women, how to think. And a lot of people don't like that idea that they should be thinking for themselves. But at the same time, we have to create on campus a community where all voices are heard. And I think we're actually working very much towards that. There were only a few people raising problems. And I think having outside agitators like the speaker is not helpful.
We're going to leave it on that note. We always appreciate hearing, you talk about hearing from voices. We always appreciate hearing from you. Professor Stiglitz, thank you so much. Nobel laureate economist, Columbia professor Joseph Stiglitz here in New York City. Check out his book, his latest book, The Road to Freedom, Economics in the Good Society. Really appreciate spending some time with you.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Business Week podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 2 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business App. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
This next book, Tim's pick, also a group fave, by New York Times global economics correspondent and award-winning journalist Peter S. Goodman. The book, How the World Ran Out of Everything Inside the Global Supply Chain. And to understand the supply chain,
Peter visits seemingly every link. He spends time with one of the largest exporters of almonds in California and the dock workers who are supposed to get those almonds all over the world. He hitches a ride through Kansas with a Brahms-loving trucker and visits ports from Los Angeles to Savannah to explain how the world found itself into the greatest supply chain crisis it's ever seen.
He is a journalist that really does his job. Here's Tim's summer read from Peter S. Goodman, his book, How the World Ran Out of Everything Inside the Global Supply Chain. Bill Clinton and China entering the WTO, the rise of globalization, McKinsey and the lean Taliban, the decline of unions and the working class, the rise of share buybacks and increasing dividends, and monopolistic takeovers, and then the pandemic and the great supply chain crisis.
Covering it all and this complex global system is New York Times global economics correspondent and award-winning journalist Peter S. Goodman. He's the author of the new book, just out, How the World Ran Out of Everything Inside the Global Supply Chain. And to understand the global supply chain, Peter visits seemingly every link of it. He spends time in one of the largest exporters of almonds in California and with the dock workers who are supposed to get those almonds all over the world. He hitches a ride through Kansas with a Brahms-loving trucker, feeds cows with a third-generation rancher in Montana, and eats breakfast with the commissioner of the Federal Maritime Commission. He visits ports from LA to Savannah to explain how the world found itself in the greatest supply chain crisis it's ever seen.
All right, he is here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We wanted to do the setup because it's really comprehensive, and I do feel like I think it's safe to say that it explains a lot of kind of where we are today. So, Peter, you have had such a front row seat to so much that is going on in the world. Tell us about that front row seat and what kind of really, stands out for you.
It's changed the way I look at any package that lands at my door, or really any product that somebody made somewhere that had to be transported to a store or to a home or a business. We don't tend to think about the supply chain. It's one of those things, it's like the light switch. We're not thinking about the internal wiring. We flip it on, the lights work. Well, when we needed it most, it failed. it buckled, and we had frontline medical workers dealing with COVID patients without protective gear. We had families unable to find infant formula. I mean, that was an incredible crisis. We had the toilet paper scare, which turned out to not be so much a shortage as a question of hoarding. And we all remember these ships, 50, 60, 70 ships that were floating off the coast of Southern California, unable to land, floating for weeks at a time before they could find a slot to load and unload all these factory goods coming in from China. And I think for all of us in the midst of the pandemic, it was so bewildering that it gave us this curiosity about these people we never think about. So yes, as you guys pointed out, I climbed into the front of a truck. I visited with rail maintenance workers who were away from their families for weeks at a time, and I really tried to understand what has gone haywire here.
Peter, the reason we're talking about such a complex supply chain is because of globalization. Your career has kind of coincided with the rise of globalization.
Right.
Being a reporter in South Asia in the 90s and then post.com crash, working for the Washington Post, I think it was out of Shanghai.
That's right.
You visited a lot of these factories at times when they weren't what they are today. Talk a little bit about how you've seen your career alongside the rise of globalization.
Yeah, I appreciate you pointing that out. So I landed in China in 2001, which was the same year that China, of course, enters the World Trade Organization, this landmark, moment for globalization. And it was pretty clear then that China had huge aspirations and that the world was flocking to China in large part because, corporate CEOs who are constantly looking for ways to cut costs availed themselves of this ultimate opportunity to engage Chinese labor as a way of undercutting labor costs at home in the US, in Japan, in South Korea, in Europe. And it was also clear that the Chinese government had very systematically built out the infrastructure that was needed for trade. So, I visited massive ports, factories that were capable of making, enough microwave ovens to supply Walmart for a year, and whole towns were set up for single industries. I remember going to the necktie town. There was this one town in one province that was suddenly making more neckties than all of Italy, in the course of a decade. So you could feel that the scale was available. But what I didn't understand, and what I've come to understand through this book, is that all of this was premised on the idea that container shipping would be basically free and reliable. And what I've come to see is that we built this global economy, putting ourselves really at the mercy of this international cartel.
If you had to pinpoint, was it President Bill Clinton, former President Bill Clinton, and the push to get everybody or to get China in the WTO, that's why we're having this conversation? That's why when the pandemic hit, we were like, what the heck happened to our global supply chain? Is it that particular moment in time that got us to here?
I think that's a landmark. I mean, there's a lot of moments in time, right? I mean, I write about Ford because I was interested in the rise of mass assembly. I write about the roots of the shipping container because the process of standardizing cargo made it possible to go look for the cheapest place to make anything. You could go anywhere around the world.
But if China wasn't accepted on a global scale in terms of trade, right? There was a big push. There were lots of concerns about human rights. There are still lots of big concerns about human rights. And yet there they were, right? In the WTO, something they fought for.
Well, here's the part that people are generally afraid to talk about. China gets into the WTO because American retailers lobby like crazy to get China into the WTO, and nobody wants to be affiliated with this story of labor exploitation. Now, let's remember, Chinese labor in American history, from the beginning, it's about undercutting wages, right? Chinese workers are systematically brought over from China to build the railroads because the mostly Irish laborers say, this is pretty dangerous and we're not getting paid enough. So this is a continuation of that story, a century later, where now we're bringing the production to China, and there's a sort of seamy, unsavory quality to the story because, of course, China is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. There's no elections. You can get access to land. You can bypass workplace and environmental standards by cutting some local party official in. on part of the spoils. Well, this is not a good story for Bill Clinton, who, only a decade before he lobbies to get China into the WTO is running as the guy who's, disciplining George H.W. Bush for coddling the butchers of Beijing. He's very critical of the crackdown against the pro-democracy demonstrators in Tiananmen Square. Well, I tell this story in the book. It's not even a decade later, and Clinton's in Beijing at a banquet at the Great Hall of the People across the street from Tiananmen Square, where he literally picks up the baton and conducts the People's Liberation Army Orchestra as they play this John Philip Sousa March. Now, why is Bill Clinton there? He's there because his party, the Democratic Party, is pulling in massive campaign contributions from retailers, and they're fashioning this story. It's not totally a fairy tale, right? I mean, trade has been the linchpin of American foreign policy since the end of the Second World War, but there are a lot of reasons to be dubious that, this is really about, it's not just about selling Chinese people lots of stuff, it's not just about buying cheap goods from China, this is about democratizing China.
Well, that was the goal, the thinking that, okay, let's open up, trade, and probably democracy will come, and the human rights abuses will go away, and yet it didn't necessarily play out that way.
Well, one part of it played out. We got really low-cost goods from China. The Walton family, the founders of Walmart, for a while became, the wealthiest family on earth. And anybody who moved production over to China at scale and managed to do the right deals rewarded their shareholders handsomely. That part held to form. Also, not incidentally, the industrialization of China lifted several 100 million people out of poverty. And that's highly significant. But the part about once Chinese people get a taste of Kentucky Fried Chicken, they're going to demand the ballot box, well, that has not worked out, as I think everyone is now aware. We're talking about genocide, according to the Biden administration, in Xinjiang, where the Uyghurs are pressed into forced labor to produce cotton that ends up in lots of apparel. Of course, we still don't have elections. The central government has actually strengthened its role in Chinese society. So we don't hear that talk anymore. And of course, now it's become politically fashionable within both parties to attack China as our enemy.
Peter, you mentioned concentration in shipping. I believe you called it a cartel.
Right.
I had no idea before reading this that it was basically, three companies?
Three alliances.
That control.
So there's a bunch of companies, but think of it like airline alliances.
Three alliances that control basically all of shipping.
95% of the shipping from China to the west coast of the United States.
Some of the companies owned by China or are state subsidized organizations. How did it become like that?
It became like that because there was deregulation pretty much everywhere, including in the U.S., where, there used to be this antitrust exemption, but there was regulation on shipping rates. So you had to post what your rates were from one place to another. You couldn't negotiate a deal in secret. It was all above board, sort of like a utility, right? Like the government's involved because this is a vital part of the economy. And then basically retailers lobbied. There were a couple of landmarks. The last one was in the 80s. There was no Amazon then, but there was Walmart, Target. The big retailers thought, well, if we're bringing over lots of these factory goods from China to the west coast of the U.S., to the east coast of the U.S., we would like to be able to negotiate a better deal than the smaller competitors. So essentially, we've optimized the supply chain for the biggest companies. And the antitrust was essentially deactivated throughout much of American life, right? You go back to Reagan, although really the story starts with Carter.
Right.
We're steeped in this idea that scale is the way to serve consumers, and so let's just get out of the way of business and let them provide. And, that will deliver innovation. But once you take away competition, of course, what we get is pricing power. And for a long time, these mostly, they're all actually foreign companies in international shipping. There were extensions of state policy in China, South Korea, Taiwan. So they were content to keep shipping costs low as a way to bolster their exports. But once we get a shock in the great supply chain disruption during the pandemic, we see shipping prices go up tenfold. And we see, you guys were alluding to the fact that I spent some time with almond farmers in Central California. We see almond farmers I visited had an entire crop sold to Dubai, to Japanese purchasers, and they were just sitting on all this crop that they couldn't actually get on a ship because these shipping carriers were making so much money sending factory goods from China to the west coast of the U.S., which is the gateway for 40% of American imports, that they didn't even want to bother to send empty containers up to the Central Valley to load up with farm products like almonds. They just unloaded factory goods in LA and sent empty containers back across the Pacific. We're talking about burning diesel fuel to send air back across the Pacific so they can get $25,000, $27,000, $28,000 to move a container of factory goods from, a place like Shanghai to LA that used to cost like $2,000, $2,500 during the pandemic. That's largely the story of deregulation.
One thing I think about, though, in particular, and in your book, is kind of the role of consultants here. And I don't want to pigpile on anyone in particular, but you do single out McKinsey.
I sure do.
You do talk about the lean Taliban. You also get into a lot of just-in-time inventory. For anybody who's taken accounting classes, like we've played around with this, right?
Right.
But this idea, too, that you don't want to have big inventories. You want to be lean and mean, right? So, because those inventories are costly to store them, to have them, and all that thing. And so this financial focus on that and this kind of narrative of saying, be lean and mean, that's a good thing. We've all played a part of it when we go through the quarterly. Lean and mean, this is a good thing for a company. How big a role did that play in getting us so that when the pandemic hit, nobody had excess supply anywhere?
A huge role. We cut inventories to the bone. Publicly traded companies cut inventories to the bone over decades. Now, just-in-time is a sensible idea. It was pioneered by Toyota. End of World War II, devastation, not a lot of capital, not a lot of land to develop. Taiichi Ono, who was running Toyota, pioneers this idea that instead of making as much stuff as possible, like Henry Ford did at Ford, and letting salespeople try to figure out how to sell it, let's just make enough to replenish the cars that we've already sold. Let's get our suppliers to deliver the stuff we need right when we need it, rather than waste capital on warehouses. Hey, that's a good idea. But along come publicly traded companies guided by consultants like McKinsey who say, listen, this should apply to everything, and you should not stop until there's basically no inventory. And what you do is, instead of wasting capital on sticking, auto parts in a warehouse as a hedge against trouble, just liquidate the warehouse, take the cash, give it to yourselves to reward yourselves, corporate executives, for being smart enough to hire McKinsey, give it to shareholders in the form of dividends and share buybacks, and everybody's happy until there's a problem. And this pandemic was not the first time we saw a shock to the system. I mean, I wrote my first supply chain story back in 1999. It was about an earthquake in Taiwan. And back then people said, oh, whoops, we've got computer chip shortages. Maybe we shouldn't concentrate all our industry here. Maybe we should have a little more diversification.
Did we learn our lesson with the computer chip industry?
We sure did not. I tell the story in the book of Henry Ford, who is a problematic figure in history, but knew a thing or two about supply chains and never wanted to be in a position where he could be pinched by a supplier, constrained. Would have been horrified to see what I saw 100 years later as I'm walking the catwalk at his signature River Rouge plant outside of Detroit, where they're making these beautiful F-150 pickup trucks, their most popular vehicle. They've got all the things they need except for the one thing that brings it to life, the computer chip. And I watched them park these cars in the shadow of Ford's corporate headquarters across the street from Henry Ford Elementary School. I mean, he would be spinning in his grave over this. We did not learn the lesson.
I think this is a part, and forgive me if I've got it wrong, but when I read it, Detroit had devolved into a poignant example of what happened when middle-class factory jobs were replaced by poverty-level positions at retailers, warehouses, and fast food chains. Next to the old Highland Park factory, now a forlorn brick shell, a shopping center called Model T Plaza was anchored by a dollar store, a payday lender, and a plasma collection center awaiting people willing to swap blood for cash. The car itself had become an instrument of white flight. Like, that to me says so much of what's going on across America and explains to me politics in a big way.
Sure.
And we want to bring in Doug Krisner's here. Doug is like this great thinker, and like your book just kind of reminds us of the things we talk about with Doug. So we wanted to bring him into it.
One of the things that's interesting, Tim was going to talk about politics. In the 1992 presidential campaign, Ross Perot was the lone voice who was kind of cautioning against, at that time, what was the North American Free Trade Agreement.
Right.
Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. What's stunning is how quickly the conversation became about China. Why did that pivot happen so quickly, in your view? Away from North America, manufacturing in China.
Well, China operates on a whole different scale than Mexico, right? So Ross Perot, of course, famously warns of the giant sucking sound. And we did lose some jobs in the industrial Midwest to Mexico, but we picked up a lot of jobs because the U.S. and Mexico are economically integrated, and I mean, it's ironic now to think about Mexico as the solution to some of our supply chain problems. But when we import something from Mexico, 40% of the value of that imported good was actually made in the United States. So, we bring in a car that was made in a Mexican factory, and 40% of the value of that car was built by American labor in American factories. The component number for China is 3%. So only 3% of the value of imports from China have American value add. And of course, Chinese state policy is really directed at driving that as close to zero as possible. But I think it's really important to note that a lot of these failures that have fueled the backlash, originally Mexico, now China, I argue in the book, I mean, this is part nobody really wants to talk about, these are homemade failures. I mean, we have benefited from trade with China. We have benefited from trade with Mexico. We've got a lot of low-cost goods. In the case of Mexico, again, we've boosted our exports. We've got consumers benefiting. A lot of data shows that consumer spending has been juiced by trade with China, and that money ends up, in the hands of American service providers. Our leisure, is more robust. We have more money here. The problem is we haven't cushioned the people who have lost. And we have seen whole communities, industries, really hit hard by this China shock that a lot of the data shows we're talking 1 million direct jobs in the space of a decade lost to Chinese imports.
But is China the bad guy, or is it investors and companies who constantly were seeking out the low-cost provider?
The ultimate winners are the investor class, without any question. And there's a lot of labor exploitation in China. So, yes, the winners are the people who funded the Clinton campaign and got Bill Clinton to get it.
To say nothing of environmental regulation.
Of course.
Okay.
Right.
Go ahead, Tim.
Peter, I want to talk about labor exploitation in the trucking industry.
Sure.
Because a common thing that we heard over and over again during the pandemic and the supply chain disruption that we saw was that trucking companies just didn't have enough drivers. They needed people to go learn how to drive a truck and start driving trucks. You found that wasn't the case. It's just a really, really bad job.
It's a horrible job. I mean, I rode with a trucker in the best possible conditions. A guy who actually likes his job. From Kansas City to Dallas and back in the middle of the winter. I slept in the cab for 2 nights. I watched this man have to worry about caffeinating enough so he wouldn't fall asleep at the wheel, and yet not having to pull over to use the restroom. Truckers are constantly worried about where they're going to park. They're at the mercy of lots of other parts of the supply chain they have no influence over. They can get stuck at warehouses for hours waiting for somebody to load or unload their vehicle because warehouses have shortages of workers. Now, this trucking industry shortage, this is an industry talking point. There's 10 million people in the United States who have licenses to drive long-haul trucks, and we need roughly a third that number. We've run out of people we can feed into the mill who are willing to sign off on these predatory lending arrangements by which truckers pay for their certification, by which they end up buying these vehicles at wildly inflated prices from the trucking companies. Then they're forced to go service these vehicles at places that are, part of the empires of these trucking companies. And so a lot of people, they get tired of being away from their families. They get tired of hearing that they've missed another child's birthday party. They miss people's funerals. It's a tough job. It's always been a tough job. The difference is it's been downgraded to the point that we've run out of takers for this tough job.
What's the remedy in your view? I mean, how do we get out of the situation that we're in now? I'm listening to the trucking story, and I'm thinking of robotic vehicles that are going to be creeping into the scene pretty soon. So the argument that you're making right now may get a remedy, but it's going to be at the cost of labor in a major way. But what do you think the remedy is longer term?
I mean, I think for openers, we got to look at these predatory arrangements that truckers make with the people coming through these educational mills that set up certification with taxpayer funding. We are paying to feed people into these training programs where they end up getting jobs that pay a fraction of what they've been promised. So that's the first thing to do. Look, automation's inevitable. It's going to happen. But we got to have a conversation about how we compensate the people who are still in the business. We got to make sure that they can get exercise, that they can eat better than they're eating. I mean, the food that you see at these truck stops, it's a tough life. The government has to get involved in looking at these working conditions. efficient.
What's the bigger solution, though? Because to me, I'm thinking, all right, if we're bringing a lot of stuff home, maybe more jobs are going to be created back home, but it's going to be more expensive. So get ready to continue to pay more money. But if it means that workers are actually making more and a real living, that's a good thing. So I don't know. I'm just trying to figure out what you see as the way forward.
In some cases, if we shift production from China to other countries where wages are higher, if we bring some of it back to the U.S., that'll mostly be automation. Yeah, the cost for some things are going to go up. Some things may go down, some things may go up. But what is the cost that we're paying now that doesn't get factored into the simple, sticker price at the Walmart superstore? What's the cost of running out of medical devices in the middle of a pandemic? What's the cost of discovering that we've depended upon a single country that we've decided is our adversary, that we're having a trade war with, for personal protective gear to give frontline medical workers?
And none of that's really changed, right, dramatically? Or has it?
It's changed somewhat. I mean, I spent a lot of time for the book. I went to Guatemala with Columbia Sportswear. They're looking to move production closer to their biggest market, which is North America. Spent a lot of time in Mexico looking, as we discussed, how that could potentially be part of the solution to our excessive reliance on China. But China's going to be the center of manufacturing for a really long time, for the simple reason that it's got this unbeatable combination of infrastructure, low cost, efficiency. The question is, how do we compensate the people who we're depending on in our own country? And Henry Ford, again, problematic character for all sorts of reasons, but he got some things right. He doubled wages for his workers in the 19 teens. He was called a communist by some people. He said, look, I'm just trying to sell cars, and I'm trying to sell them at low prices. And any business that's built on low-wage labor is unreliable.
Away from the government, is there a role for organized labor in this?
Oh, 100%. I mean, we should be embracing labor mobilization. I mean, it's bumpy. It does involve higher costs. If you're running a business, you're not delighted that your union is now animated. But first of all, it puts spending capacity in people's pockets, right? It boosts consumer power, which is good for all businesses. And it's simply more reliable if people are at work, not worried about their ability to put groceries on there.
I was thinking about that when I read about precision scheduled railroading in your book, because those were union guys, right?
Right.
But they had a pretty tough gig, too.
Some of them are union guys.
So you wrote about people who missed medical appointments and funerals and were driving so far from their homes in that business. Were the unionized folks who were doing that in a much better position than the non-unionized ones? I mean, because that's a tough gig, too.
Look, the unions, were ready to go on strike and couldn't go on strike because there's this law that says they have to basically get the president's permission to strike, and the president didn't grant that permission because it would have been a shock to the system. It would have upped inflation, and that wasn't something that Joe Biden wanted to happen on his watch. But even, this powerful union that got right to the edge of strike, they couldn't get paid sick leave. Biden gave it to them through the bully pulpit, and some of the companies then delivered a few days. But yes, I talked to people who were missing out on, in one case, a guy whose infant, needed cardiac surgery. And he was told, sorry, pal, we need you on the maintenance crew. You can't be home for that. And he finally quit and fired off a letter. Yeah, go ahead.
No, but so much for was it a few years ago, the Business Roundtable stakeholder, think of all the stakeholders, including employees.
That's my last book.
We only have, I know, 20 seconds left. Are we going to run out of things again at some point?
Yes. Talk to contractors about why they can't build more housing. It's part of why housing's so unaffordable.
This was so much fun. So appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank
Peter
you,
Goodman,
guys.
global economic correspondent, New York Times, his new book, How the World Ran Out of Everything. And then, thanks to our Doug Krisner, too. We really appreciate you coming in.
Nice meeting you.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Businessweek podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business App. Or watch us live on YouTube.
We continue with our summer reading, pick number 3, courtesy of our Business Week weekend and remote broadcast producer, Sebastian Escobar, who says this next book truly puts into perspective the power humanity holds to radically advance or even destroy our future. And that the question now is not whether we should use these powers, but how best to use them.
Sebastian's choice comes from Jamie Metzl, who's the author of Hacking Darwin, Genetic Engineering and the Future of Humanity, and 4 other books. Jamie also served in the U.S. National Security Council, State Department, and Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and with the United Nations in Cambodia.
He was also a member of the World Health Organization Expert Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing, and currently Jamie works as a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and founder and chair of the nonprofit One Shared World.
The book that Sebastian picked is Jamie's latest. It's a book that explores the ways humanity can utilize technology for building a better world, or potentially cause more harm. The book, Superconvergence: How the Genetics, Biotech, and AI Revolutions Will Transform Our Lives, Work, and World.
So this book, in many ways, it's the culmination kind of my entire life. And I'm trying to ask the question is, what do we do and how do we manage these two most fundamental transformations of our lives? And those two transformations are, this is the moment after 3.8 billion years of life on Earth that our one species has developed these two transformational superpowers. And that's we are creating novel intelligence and have developed the capacity to recast all of life, including our own. And the one question that's going to determine whether our species thrives in the future or doesn't is whether we can use these new godlike superpowers wisely. And Carol, you mentioned my last book, Hacking Darwin, was all about the future of human genetic engineering. And then I was, as you and I have discussed, deeply involved in the issues of pandemic origins. I was a member of the World Health Organization Expert Committee on Human Genome Editing after the first CRISPR babies were born. And so I definitely am deeply involved in the science of what these intersecting AI, genetics, and biotechnology revolutions mean, and then the applications, healthcare, agriculture, manufacturing, data storage, and lots of other things. But then the question is, well, how do we do it? And so one is we need to be very cognizant of the dangers, which are very real. And then we need to say, what's the path forward? How do we do this wisely? And what are the building blocks of getting to the place where we want to be? Because if we get this right, we can have much better healthcare, more abundant foods for everybody around the world, and all kinds of wonderful things. And if we get it wrong,
right,
we can get symbio pandemics, we can crash ecosystems, we can undermine our very humanity. And that's why I've written a book for everyone. I want people to take this book to the beach and be comfortable and having fun reading it on the beach. Say, oh, that was a really easy read, but I actually learned a lot and it sparked a lot of meaningful conversation.
I have to say that I have been watching, though, a video you did where you talked about the book. You're in San Jose, California. You're competing in an ultramarathon. It's raining. You talk about your hands getting numb. You're sniffling because it's cold. It's raining.
Are you walking or running, Jamie? Just to clarify here, it looks like you're walking.
Can I say, I am so honored that you are sharing this with your viewers. So, for those of you who don't do ultramarathons are hard. An ultramarathon is a race longer than a marathon. The ones that I do are 50-kilometer, 32-mile races, and I do mountain trail runs. And I was in San Jose speaking at Synbio Beta, which is the big synthetic biology conference that my friend John Cumbers runs. And I thought, oh, this is going to be easy. Famous last words. I'm just going to go the day before the conference and I'll run this race. San Jose, the weather's perfect. How big could the hills be? So it turns out the hills were pretty big. And it turned out they had this uncharacteristic freezing, like rainy, slushy storm. And it was like, I'm so much older than you guys, but you know what a 3-hour tour means when you think it's going to be,
we know.
This is going to be easy.
Gilligan's Island.
It was a 3-hour tour. And so then I knew that somebody had asked me to record a video about the book, and I was walking up this hill at mile like 30, and it was kind of this straight up, what can I do? I'm going to record that. It's like you're insane at those moments. I'm going to record a video about this book. That seems like a good idea. So I did it. And
well,
there you go.
I was thinking though, watching it, and I was like, it feels, when you're out in nature, you sometimes, for me, my brain opens up, I think differently, maybe more clearly about some of the big ideas and trends and innovations, disruptions, whatever the heck you want to call them, that are coming at us big time. How do you cross nature with some of these dynamic trends that are coming at us that will clearly test kind of natural evolutionary theory that has dominated for so long?
This is why you're such a great journalist, Carol, to make such a smooth transition as that one. I mean, what I'll say is, the things that we call nature aren't natural. If you go to Whole Foods and go to the fruits and vegetables section, you would be hard-pressed to find a fruit or a vegetable that 20,000 years ago existed in anything like its current form. It almost doesn't exist. Maybe there's one or two things. if you, like when I was out hiking in San Jose, well, it seemed like nature because there were a lot of trees. But if we mean by nature what it was like before humans changed everything, like no one went hiking just for fun because the saber-toothed tiger will eat you if you do that. And so the thing that we call nature is just the world that our ancestors managed and manipulated. Like your dog didn't exist 50,000 years ago in this
there was no scout
in this format. And so and even if you are the most indigenous farmer in the highlands of Peru growing quinoa from ancient varieties of seeds, you are a radical biotechnologist. Much more the difference between the precursors to our domesticated crops and our current non-GMO corn and our current GMO corn, the difference between the precursors and corn is way more than the minuscule difference between current corn and GMO. So the starting point for this has to be the choice that we are making as a species is not natural versus unnatural. It's how do we interact with the living world that we have been managing and manipulating for thousands of years, and do so in the smartest, most economical, safest, most sustainable way to achieve the things that we want to achieve. And what are those things? Well, we don't want to die of terrible cancer. We want to have gene therapy, so somebody who's born with something like sickle cell disease, rather than living a life of excruciating pain and then dying prematurely, can live a normal life. We want to grow more crops on less land to feed more people.
So, Jamie, my question for you is, after doing the research and reporting for this book and your other books, how do you live your life differently? What do you eat that's different? What do you do that's different than you used to do now that you found all this through research?
Yeah, so it's funny. People ask me this a lot because I'm deeply involved in the world of for example, the science of human life extension, and everyone says, "Oh, you must be taking the NAD plus boosters and metformin, and you must be like doing like the thing where they cut open the old and young mice and sew them together. You must be doing that with." I don't know who, or your girlfriend or something. And I don't do any of that. What I do is a few things. One, just in terms of my personal life, I exercise an hour a day and eat healthy and do all those blue zone things that everybody knows you're supposed to do and are hard to do. Certainly in my healthcare, I try to get ahead of the curve because I write about the future of healthcare in the book. And where we're going is from our current world of healthcare based on population averages. You have a headache and you go to CVS and you pick up a Tylenol, to our new world of healthcare precision or personalized healthcare based on each person's individual biology, because a small percentage of people who take a Tylenol will have a terrible adverse reaction and could even die. And so better to know you're one of those people before you take the Tylenol. That's true for cancer therapies and all of that. So in that process, we're gaining a lot of information about systems biology, so the complexity of human biology.
Right.
And then that's the next shift in our healthcare, which is from precision to predictive and preventive, where with all of this data, and the formula for all of this stuff is the more high quality data you have, the more computing power, and the stronger algorithms, the more we're going to be able to decipher actionable patterns. That's going to change healthcare and industry and agriculture and everything.
One thing I wanted to ask you, the way the book starts, you have two quotes, but you say, this is from Stuart Brand, "We are as gods and might as well get good at it." What's the message there? It feels pretty powerful.
For millennia, our ancestors imagined these all-powerful gods that could create new stuff. They could recast life. They could grant people's wishes to live extra life. They could transform the world around them. We can now do all of those things. So we are, in many ways, not in all ways, in many ways, we are the all-powerful gods that we have imagined in our past. And just like we've imagined those gods can build and destroy, we can build and destroy. And so now we have these superpowers. And the question is, are we going to use them to build, to make a better future for us individually, for our companies, for our countries, and for our world, and do it in really practical ways? Or are we just going to not do what needs to be done, not create the right frameworks and governance and values and accountability and all the things that are required to make sure this story has as happy of a process, because there's no ending, process as possible. If we don't do those things, we're really going to be in trouble. And that's why I've written the book. That's why I'm so passionate about bringing everybody into this conversation, because it's in the early, when you're doing anything, starting a company, that's when you need to say, hey, here's what we stand for. Here are our values.
Right.
And then everything gets built on that. If we don't have a conversation of what we're trying to achieve, who we are, and what are the core values that are going to guide us, if we make this a conversation just about the technology itself, we're going to wind up in a very unfamiliar and most likely scary place.
I have to say, I'm already scared because I question the moral values and ethics that I feel like people have really lost. I want to ask you, genetics, biotech, AI, what worries you the most that we could get wrong?
There is a reason why anxiety has been preserved by evolution. Anxiety is actually a really healthy emotion for us and for every animal, because we're afraid of things, and that is what inspires us to say, hey, this terrible thing could happen. I could be eaten by some horrible animal, so I'm going to start planning so that that doesn't happen. And so these fears that we have, I mean, there are some people who are just such techno-optimists. They say just do nothing and the future is going to be great. That is not true. Bad things could happen. We need to be honest now about what they are. A few of them that I highlight in the book. One, as I mentioned, I was a member of the World Health Organization Expert Advisory Committee on Human Genome, and Dr. Tedros, the director of the WHO, created that after the world's first CRISPR babies were born in China in 2018. That was a terrible violation. If we just say, hey, let's just do whatever, willy-nilly human experimentation, we're going to wind up with more Nuremberg trials and those kinds of violations. We have the capacity to use gene drives, which is basically we put a little molecular scissors almost into the sex cells that pass between animals, and we could use it to wipe out malarial mosquitoes. And that would be great. We could save 1 million lives per year. But we don't know how these full ecosystems work. And if we're not careful, we could also crash whole ecosystems, not because we're trying to do harm, but because we're trying to do good. And as you and I have talked about this before, Carol, but I've been in the middle for the last almost 4.5 years of this debate about COVID-19 origins. And it's my view that the preponderance of the available evidence suggests a research-related origin in Wuhan. And it's very likely that these Chinese scientists, who weren't trying to create bioweapons, but were most likely trying to create a pan-coronavirus vaccine and had an accident and didn't realize what had happened, and then things got worse and worse. So it's not just that we're going to have Dr. Evil doing bad stuff. It could be that well-intentioned people who are trying to prevent terrible diseases or to stop malarial mosquitoes or all sorts of things. And that's why, again and again, I keep going back to values.
Right.
It's establishing the North Star. Where are we heading?
That makes us think about, Tim and I talk a lot about AI.
Yeah. So Jamie, my question for you is where could AI go wrong, and what are the indications now about the direction that it's moving in?
AI, like all of these technologies, can be used for good or for ill. And we're seeing both of those things right now. We're seeing AI being applied in healthcare settings, in agriculture, and all these other areas, in companies, and it's helping solve real problems in very practical ways. And we're seeing deep fakes, manipulations, all kinds of problems with AI, and these are just the early days. And right now, when people think about AI, most people think, oh, AI equals ChatGPT. Like, I'm going to go to this website and then I'm going to do AI. But if I were to ask you guys, how did electricity influence your life today? It's an unanswerable question, because electricity, it's in your alarm clock, it's in your house, it's in your air conditioning, it's in the microphone, it's in our clothes, it's in our haircuts. It's just, electricity is part of everything that we do. And these technologies are going to be part of everything that we do, part of our accounting systems, our interacting systems, how we interact with the world, how everything is made.
Right.
And that's why we need to think systemically and systematically about these technologies. And there are some of these people who say, oh, just no regulation, government get out of the way. That's the last thing we need. We need wise governance and wise regulation.
Yeah, everything. Well, my dad used to say everything in moderation. I know everybody's dad says that or mom says that. But it's also everything, like you got to have some oversight of all this stuff.
It's true.
Jamie, good luck. So much fun to catch up with you again. Thank you so much for finding time for us once again here at Bloomberg. Jamie, take care. Be well.
And good luck also in the future ultra marathons.
I know, he's pretty impressive. I highly recommend you check out that YouTube video because he really does go through so much of the book. And like I said, it's raining, there's mud. Jamie is, of course, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, founder and chair of the nonprofit One Shared World. Check out his new book, Super Convergence: How the Genetics, Biotech, and AI Revolutions Will Transform Our Lives, Work, and World. It's coming out on Tuesday.
He'd spent a few times with us during COVID. Came on talking because as he mentioned, he looked very closely and has been looking very closely at the origins. So we had him on a few times.
60 Minutes has done a big piece on certainly his thinking there. So fun things.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Business Week podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 2 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business App. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Plenty ahead in our second hour of our weekend edition of Bloomberg Business Week. Our team's summer reading list continues, including the book about the individual who left a cult and her family, made her way on Wall Street when it wasn't so easy for a woman, and earned a nickname along the way.
Also, from Colonel Sanders and Mel Brooks and Norman Lear to Carol Channing, Rita Moreno, and Henri Matisse, the octogenarians that are rocking their later years. And Carol's pick, no surprise, as the sailor of the group. Her selection, Sailing Alone, a surprising history of isolation and survival at sea.
First up this hour, though, let's get to the fourth book on our summer reading list. This one from our YouTube producer, Elizabeth Cedron, who says Patricia Walsh Chadwick had a compelling story of leaving a cult and then climbing the corporate investment ladder, and that she had a smart perspective on investment cycles while not leaning into girl boss rhetoric. Sounds like Elizabeth.
Well, we've got your attention, right? Chadwick started as a receptionist at a brokerage firm at the age of 19, and 30 years later was named a global partner at Invesco. Needless to say, she's seen a lot of eras and cycles on Wall Street.
It's in her book, Breaking Glass, Tales from the Witch of Wall Street. Here's Patricia Walsh Chadwick with her story.
I did not know I was called the Witch of Wall Street until 5 years ago. And it was
Are you serious?
I am serious. It was my 70th birthday party. I don't mind saying that. And there was a woman who said she had met me in 1985. I remembered it well. And she was with Bear Stearns. And she told me that she was told by the head of institutional sales, we have a very big important account at Citibank. One woman runs a lot of the money there, but we have a problem. The men are afraid of her. These are the institutional salespeople.
Because?
And apparently I was fairly demanding, but that was my job. So she said, I had heard of this woman, but I had never met her. And all I knew was on the trading floor, they called her the Witch of Wall Street. And I was oblivious, and I only heard that 5 years ago, been out of Wall Street for a long time. I was shocked. I really was. And then I thought about it for a while, and I thought, okay, so maybe I did break some china along the way, and maybe some of the characteristics that might get a man called the Wolf of Wall Street, you know, aggressiveness and demanding, get a woman called the Witch of Wall Street. And I decided that I would embrace it rather than run away from it.
So you're owning it.
I own it. I own it.
I was just going to say, did it bother you? Or like when you think back and you just, it's interesting because we have a lot of conversations about aggression from a man versus a woman. Unfortunately, we still have it that can often be respected versus a woman is, you know, not a witch, but another word that rhymes with it.
And so precisely.
I'm trying to understand. So take us, like, I don't know, first of all, that era, go back, it was a different Wall Street.
It was a very different Wall Street, and there were very few women who would really come in power, and that's why the title is Breaking Glass. I mean, I don't talk about shattering glass or anything, but you get to a certain point, and then you're able to break through it.
Right.
And a lot of women aren't. I think women are treated more difficultly in terms of promotions, because I think everything looks like a return on investment, and it's how much do we want to invest in her if she's not going to stay? Mm-hmm. And not going to stay generally means
having
if
kids.
she has, yes, precisely.
Yeah.
And so I think women have to understand and accept that reality and just be even more aggressive. And I don't say that derogatorily. Mm-hmm. You've just got to be there. You've got to play the hard game if you're going to be in it for the long haul.
Did you have kids?
I did. I was 45 when I had my twins.
Wow.
So I had quite a long haul. And I'll tell you honestly, there was a time when I wondered whether I could be a good businesswoman, a good wife, and a good mother simultaneously. And then when I had them, and it was wonderful for about 6 years.
Yeah.
But very truthfully, I think an important story in my book is that we were on vacation and our children were 5 years old, and we were on the beach, and my husband came home one day with them, and he said, "Sweetheart, we're on the beach swimming, and you're on conference calls." And I thought about that overnight, and I woke up the next morning and I said, "Honey, I'm going to retire." And I retired at the age of 51.
Yeah.
It was a big step to take, but in my mind, it was the right one for me.
Yeah.
It was the right one for our family and what I did. And I ultimately had another.
Well, I was going to say, you didn't really retire. This is not your first book. And
That's
you were
true.
also, global partner at Invesco, and it's certainly in a second career as a member of many corporate boards.
I did corporate boards and I did expert witness work. So yes, but it allowed me to do what I did want to do.
Yeah.
I didn't want my children being raised by nannies. And so, I accept the fact, and I think most women have to accept the fact, you're going to have some more difficult choices than likely men are.
Was it the right move to retire at 51?
For me, absolutely. I don't look back with any regret on it at all.
Would you have, if you were to do it again, retired earlier if you could have?
No, I think the time my children were twins and they were 5th grade going into kindergarten, perfect time. I don't have to make all the play dates when they're 2 and 3 and 4.
Right.
But I did want to be there to answer the questions when they were getting older. So for me, it was perfect.
Well, it's funny because Tim and I have had this conversation because he's back. Well, now it's over a year.
Almost a year, yeah.
Almost a year that took a paternal leave. A leave after.
But like a real leave, not like
6 months. 6 months.
Which is
done.
unheard of.
Which is incredible that our company does.
I was going to say that. Credit to Bloomberg. That is fantastic.
It was fantastic, and I think it's also changed a lot just in recent years. I mean, I wasn't at Bloomberg when I had my first kid, but I got 2 weeks off at that point, and it just makes such a difference for when you're raising a family.
But what did we can be real? And
be real.
About this on air.
I've talked about a lot. I don't know where you're going to go with this.
We talked about this on air. No, but the point of that we need men to take that 6 months so that it kind of evens the playing field, if you will, right? Of that, I'm not, the female isn't necessarily the only one that disappears from the workforce for 6 months or what have you, that it's good to see both parents doing it.
It's something that is not done very much in our business, the world of finance and investing, but it's done much more in Europe.
Yeah.
And I think we can learn from them.
Take us back, though, to your first job on Wall Street.
I was 19 years old, and I had been given the job, I hired a job for $90 a week. And I was so proud of myself for getting the job.
Can I ask you what year this was?
This was 1968.
1968. Okay.
But it was more than the minimum wage, so I was very proud of that. And all I wanted to be was the best receptionist in the world. 6 months later, George Burton, who is one of my mentors, my book is dedicated to my mentors, he brought me into his office and he said, "We're going to give you a raise from $90 a week to $100. And I did my quick arithmetic and went, well, that's 11%, but that's in 6 months, so that's really 22%. And I felt so empowered. And then 2 months later, it was Christmas time, and he called me in and he said, "We're very pleased with your work, and we're going to give you a $1,500 bonus." It was like a third of my salary. I started investing, and that was about the first thing. Literally, less than a year later, he sent me to New York to close a deal. I didn't know what a deal was. I got into New York. I had a limousine that took me around to 5 places. I collected 5 checks, each for $1 million, went back to Boston, presented them to him. He and his partner took me out to dinner at the Ritz-Carlton. And that night, I lay in bed and said, I wonder if I might ever have a job like theirs someday. So it was from lowly beginnings, but I think the message of my book is, be adaptable, learn, put your hand up all the time, and little by little, when you are adaptable, you'll become more confident. When you're more confident, you'll be successful. And it's not a very complicated story.
So, Patricia, that's exactly where I want to start, is the beginning. And I'm not talking about 19 years old and your job as a receptionist. I'm talking about early on, and because you have an interesting story that I think would surprise a lot of people.
Yes, and that story was my first book. It was called Little Sister. I was born into a religious community in, of all places, Cambridge, Massachusetts, so part of the real involved world, a group of highly intelligent, highly educated people, all Catholics. And they were under the auspices of a priest named Father Leonard Feeney, a renowned Jesuit, and a woman named Catherine Clark, who created the entity, which was really for Catholics at Harvard and Radcliffe and other schools to have an opportunity to meet and talk about their own religion. And during the war, World War II that is, it was very, very popular. And after the war, when all the veterans were coming back, Father Feeney was the most popular lecturer in the world. My parents met there. My father had been a naval officer during World War II. He was getting his graduate degree in philosophy at Boston College. And my mother was 12 years younger, and she was a brand new 18-year-old convert to Catholicism. They met, they got married. A year later, I was born. But under Father Feeney's influence, the organization became very, very doctrinaire about you had to be Catholic to be saved. And it was at the time that ecumenism was spreading. And the idea was religions should all get together and, they all worship God in one way or another. And let's not, say that we have battlegrounds. But that was not the way they took it. And so pretty soon Father Feeney was no longer allowed to practice as a Catholic priest. My parents stayed with him. In a way, that was the only world I knew. And there were 60 adults. Yeah. Among that were 12 married couples. And then 39 children came along. I was one of the oldest. And all of a sudden, things really started to change. We had a number of houses in Cambridge, and they built a big red stockade fence. So now the whole world was shut out.
It's like a compound.
A compound, absolutely. And when I was 6, the children were separated from the parents. And then the parents were arm twisted, seriously, to take vows of celibacy. And my father said, absolutely not. And Father Feeney came back to him. And finally, Father Feeney said to him, you're the one couple, the only holdout of the 12. Mm-hmm. So they felt they had to do it. They really wanted us to have a very Catholic education. Years later, one of the other children told me his parents told him the very same story. Wow. So it had been this divide and conquer.
Right.
And now the children were not being brought up by the parents were not able to be together. And it was a monastic environment. Silence most of the day. We're not allowed to address our parents, speak to them at all. And so people say, well, why did they do that and all of that? That was their decision. But my father used to break the rules, and breaking the rules to me was what told me that he loved me. Yeah. And the fact of the matter is, I never blamed my parents. Somehow, I think I was a bright little girl, but somehow I blamed Catherine Clark, whom we called Sister Catherine, and Leonard Feeney for separating my parents. And I never thought of it as a cult. You will not see the word cult in my first book. Yeah. It was my home. It was my daughter, when she was 20 years old and came home from college, and she said, Mom, I have 2 things to tell you. I'm thinking, what is that? And she said, first, you have to stop everything until you finish this book. And then she said, and you have to accept the fact that you grew up in a cult. I never thought of it that way. It was my home, and I loved it in many ways. But ultimately, I accept the fact that it was a cult. And then when I was about 14 or 15, I started having crushes on boys. Now, that was not going to keep me in the community. Sister Catherine wanted every one of the children to grow up, remain celibate for life. I would be a bride of Christ. But I had these dreams of a prince coming into the garden and sweeping me off. And, we would go off and live in a castle and have lots of children. Not that I knew how any of that would happen. And the next thing I knew, she kicked me out. No opportunity to come back.
How old were you when you were kicked out?
17. I had just graduated from high school. We were schooled within our own community.
Yeah.
I'd never, seen a television show, never read a newspaper, never been to a grocery store, never held a dollar bill for a gal.
Where did you go?
So I had been accepted at 2 colleges because they needed the school to be accredited. And I was a good student. And I got into Vassar, and I got into Bates, where my father had gone.
Yeah.
She made me write a letter saying that I wasn't coming. She said it would be I would lose my soul if I went to college. So she allowed me to go to a secretarial school so that I could get the necessary skills to be able to earn my own living. And my first place to live was at a room in the YWCA in a not very fashionable section of Boston.
How does something like that You seem pretty normal.
Oh, but I'm not.
I don't even know what normal is anymore. But you know what I mean. And you've done really well. And I just wonder, though, what of that still stays with you or impacted you as you ventured out into the world?
And also raised your own family.
Yes. Oh, yes. I mean, I look back on my life. I know it was very abnormal and very strange, but I look back and I wouldn't change anything. I'm not saying I wouldn't have had more time with my parents. Of course I would have. Yeah. But I think the way one's path goes in life ultimately leads you to where you are, happily married, 2 children, who one of them's now engaged. I mean, they're 30 years old now. They're young adults. And I just think sometimes you're given the ability to get over the things that aren't good and find the best in them. Sister Catherine herself was never a mentor to me. But I believe she was a role model. This was a woman who ran a community of 100 people. Not one man pushed back on her. Not one woman pushed back on her. And I think when I got into that dog-eat-dog world of Wall Street, subliminally in the back of my mind, my only model was someone who ran things and was a woman.
Right.
And I think I just went, okay, that's what I got to do. I'm going to do this. I never thought I can't do that because I'm a woman. So I have to give her a little credit.
So maybe that's the perfect segue to getting from your first job or your first role to one where you move to the business side. You said you lay awake at night wondering how you could become one of those deals people.
Yes.
So how did you do that?
It was little baby steps, let me tell you. One of the first things I did was by the age 21, I became a stockbroker. I didn't end up getting customers. I just thought, I can do that. Then I had to do those S&P tear sheets. You're both way too young to know what they are. But
memorize
they were books.
Tickers?
Pardon me?
Did you memorize tickers?
I memorized every ticker on the New York Stock Exchange. And I would go into the trading room and I would give myself tests. And I just found the whole thing so exciting. And by the time I moved to Philadelphia with my best girlfriend, I was becoming an assistant to the analysts. And the one thing I said of them, there were 6 men that I was reporting to. I said, listen, I don't want to just put numbers on a piece of paper for you. I want to learn what those numbers mean. And I want you to promise me that you'll answer all the questions I have. I was ready to walk away from that job if they had said, no, we just want you to give us the numbers. They kept their words, every one of them. And I walked away after 2 years. I wasn't even 25 yet. And I understood how the trucking industry worked, and the airline industry, and the insurance industry. And so from there, it was just a little step bigger till I became an analyst.
Well, it's like you have this incredible story, and understanding that story is an important part of you, but understanding, I think we feel that way, like investment stories, like understanding the story or the fundamentals or what something really is, rather than just a sheet of numbers, right, and understanding
Absolutely.
it. 30 seconds left. What would you like to share with our audience?
Well, I do think for young people, and I love mentoring, it's important to have mentors in your life. It is also really important to be adaptable.
Yeah.
I think put your hand up, say yes. Ask someone for help. Don't be afraid to. And you'll find little by little, the first time it's hard, and then you have more confidence, and then you build up your own resilience. And I think everyone should have a mentor. There's no such thing as a bad mentor. They're either a mentor or they're not.
If you were starting today, 15 seconds left, would you still go to Wall Street, do you think?
I love it. So
okay.
Me, I adore it.
Just checking to see if you're feeling about it.
Yes, and I think it can be a great place for women. It really can.
All right, love it. Promise you'll come back when the paperback comes out.
Or even sooner.
Or even
this was
sooner.
great.
Or even sooner. What an amazing tale. Has Netflix called and said we need to make this into a series?
There have been little talks about different little things.
I would watch
Good question.
that. All right, Patricia Walsh-Chadwick, former global partner at Invesco, her book, Breaking Glass Tales from the Witch of Wall Street.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Business Week podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business App. Or watch us live on YouTube.
Now to our 5th pick on our summer reading list, our team summer reading list, from the producer of our daily Bloomberg Businessweek broadcast and podcast, Paul Brennan, who says, as someone who is later in his life and waiting for his own triumph to come, Paul was inspired by Mo's profiles, and any mention of his hero, Paul's hero, Mel Brooks, it's a plus.
And by Mo, he means Mo Rocca, a correspondent for CBS Sunday Morning, a frequent panelist on NPR's Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, and the host and realtor of the cooking channels My Grandmother's Ravioli. Also, he spent years earlier in his career as a correspondent on The Daily Show, as well as on The Tonight Show with Jay Leno.
Yeah, he does a lot, man. His perspective's a lot of fun, too. Mo Rocca is also the New York Times bestselling author of Mobituaries, Great Lives Worth Reliving, a companion to his podcast of the same name. His new book out just recently, Octogenarians, Late in Life Debuts, Comebacks, and Triumphs.
It was my first job, and it is the toolbox I keep going back to all the time. Honestly, I don't want to sound too grand about it, talking about being a storyteller, but really that job was storytelling boot camp, because we, a very small writing staff, had to take classic novels and break them down into half-hour episodes as seen through the eyes of a Jack Russell Terrier, a dog for kids between the ages of 6 and 11. It was like a writing assignment devised by an English professor on acid, and it was just the best way to learn. And, you know, my boss there, she gave me some real tough love, because I sort of thought, I don't really know what I'm doing. And so my scripts were kind of half-baked. And she said, you just had to figure this out. And she took a couple of books on really screenwriting, and she just threw them down on my desk at one point. She said, figure it out, because this is a great opportunity. And it was a great opportunity, in part because 6 to 11-year-olds, you can't fool them. And so you can't just write a lazy script with characters just kind of talking to each other. It has to be really lean and dynamic, and the action has to keep moving forward, or they'll lose interest. So it was a really great audience to have to write for.
What is it about getting snapshots of, people's lives, individuals, great works, as you did with Wishbone? What is it about kind of like telling vignettes that you love doing? Because you do this, it's obviously in this book.
I mean, it's sort of the same thing that drew me to obituaries, which was the subject of my last book and podcast. A good obituary is about someone's life, not their death. And I love a good life story.
I love reading obituaries, especially but go ahead.
No, because a good obituary is sort of like the trailer for an Oscar-winning biopic. It has a sweep, a drama, romance, the highs, the lows, the triumphs, the tragedies. And my father was a real romantic and a very optimistic person, very buoyant. And so he loved to read, growing up in the Washington D.C. area when there were 2 daily papers. He would say, oh boy, the obits is my favorite section of the paper. So I just love a person's story. It's hard. I'm not sure how else to put it. Yeah.
Do they also, though, teach us about how we want to live our lives?
Completely. I mean, there are times that I've been a competitive obit writer, like you're sort of reading an obit and then you go, oh my God, he did all of that by the time he was 25.
Right. Not to make it all about the person who's not dead, but...
Right. I know, but it's hard not to sometimes. And then you're like, oh my God, he went to prison at 35. I'm doing fine. So there's this metric going. But I mean, in this case, my co-author and I wanted to tell stories of people who accomplished great things late in life, because obviously old age, advanced age is very much in the news, a very hot topic. Not just in politics, but as the population ages.
Well, I think I would say for myself, like, I think as I've gotten older, history in general is interesting, but also I think about the older folks that have been in my lives. Like, I love hearing about their stories and kind of what they had to go through. Mm-hmm. Having said that, sometimes having it's the folks that you write about, sometimes it's their first chapter, sometimes it's the second chapter, sometimes it's the third chapter. Kind of talk to us a little bit about that, right? It's not sometimes their first act.
Right.
Or sometimes it is.
Well, exactly. It's a variety. It's debuts, comebacks, and sort of it's capstones. A lot architects. It's one of these amazing things that architects just keep getting better and better. And I think there are a couple of practical reasons. If you're doing a commission for a big, expensive building, you want somebody with experience, right? You probably don't want a young starter architect.
Right.
And more architects of advanced age also are likely to have a staff doing a lot of the grunt work by that point. But all of these people have in common that they don't accept this very strange, pervasive, and kind of insidious message that your third act of life is a time to kind of wind things down. I'm not sure where that came from. And also, we're going to continue living longer and longer. If we're fortunate and have good health, decent health care. There are also people that don't look backwards. They're very in it. So they're not doing victory laps. They're not sitting at home playing highlight reels of their, great achievements. And that's okay if you want to do that. If you want to do that and hang out and just reminisce, but that's not what these people in this book do.
I want to get to some of the stories in just
Please.
a few minutes, but before we do that, talk a little bit about the organization of the book, because it reads in a really interesting way.
I have learned from the best at CBS Sunday Morning, which is a 45-year-old arts and culture show on CBS. My executive producer, Rand Morrison, believes very much in mix, show mix. Like you have to, and part of that is surprises. So you go from, I'm proud that the book includes Henri Matisse and Clara Peller, the Where's the Beef lady, and a tortoise, Mr. Pickles.
I knew you were going to get to Mr.
Right,
Pickles.
we had to get to Mr. First-time father at 90. Take that, Al Pacino. But so mix is very important. I think when you turn the page, you want to be. I mean, I'm big into delight. Like on my obit, I would just want it to be like Mo Rocca, who delighted audiences, died today. He was 116. But like that's a big part of it. So it's not chronological. We just wanted it to have a decent mix so that, it's, I almost think of it in terms of protein and carbs. Like some stories have import and kind of grandeur, like Mary Church Terrell, the civil rights leader who at the age of 86 led sit-ins at segregated Washington, D.C. lunch counters. But that's a good, like, filling, nutritious, really story. And then you want something just kind of fizzy and fun. Carol Channing finding love at 82.
Yeah. It is fascinating. There's just so many different names. There are names people will definitely know. There are names that people might not. How did you go about figuring out who you wanted to include?
Well, I didn't want to go... I hate to start with what I didn't want to do, but I didn't want to go too entertainment heavy. There are actors, Rita Moreno, whom I've interviewed before, and
who's a pistol.
Who is really a pistol. I mean, she's amazing at 92. Morgan Freeman, because I love the Electric Company, and they both were on it, and they kind of have intertwined lives. By law, we had to include at least one Golden Girl. I think we would have been arrested if we didn't. And Estelle Getty was a story to tell because she made her television debut at 62, really after a life of kind of raising her family and doing every little bit of off Broadway theater she could. So, I mean, it just seemed right that she should have this amazing, iconic role at the end. But we wanted to make sure that there was a real range of people. So one of the things I'm interested in is sort of people who are obviously respected, but kind of famous in sort of sub-worlds, if you will. So I called my friend Scott Ehrlich, whose family has worked in winemaking for many years, and I said, who is someone in the winemaking world that's just remarkable for his longevity? And he's, without skipping a beat, he said Mark Grgic is the guy, a Croatian immigrant, or an immigrant from what was then Yugoslavia. And he was alive at the time. He only died last year, right before our publication. So he was active up until the age of 100. And I love the fact that he was really the reason, this amazing immigrant story, that that American, specifically California wines, became contenders. The Judgment of Paris in 1976, when American wines and French wines were competed against each other in a blind taste test in Paris, organized by kind of a wag of a British promoter who expected it to be a runaway French victory. And both the red and white Americans, the white from Grgic's winery, won.
Shockingly,
it shocked the world. It changed the world of wine. And I just loved his story. And he's somebody who had persevered throughout his life, but late into his life, bringing winemaking in a very elevated way back to his homeland of Croatia. So it had a beautiful full circle.
Right?
Yeah.
You also stumble on names when you're reading the book and you say, wait a second, I've always seen a Roget's Thesaurus on a bookshelf or as a college student. I had no idea there was a guy named Roget, and he was old when he wrote it.
He was, and I keyed into him because I love making lists myself. And, I know the capital of every country in the world, and I used to do strange things as a child.
Don't make us quiz you.
Wait.
No, I know. Please don't quiz me right now.
Where do we go?
Please don't throw out a random country name. Please don't do that.
Okay.
She's thinking Brunei, and the capital is Bandar Seri Begawan.
Show off.
Okay, and Tim, now you ask, what's the capital of Djibouti?
Yeah, Djibouti.
The capital of Djibouti is Djibouti. Trick question,
right?
That's
okay.
it. Yeah.
That's a good one.
So
you like lists.
I used to make crazy lists, and I used to waterways near state capitals. That's one. But anyway, Peter Mark Roget did the same thing as a child. I think for different reasons. I did it because I was just maybe sort of curious and strange, which are synonyms, right? And he had a lot of tragedy in his life, personal loss, and one of his biographers believe it was a way of coping. But he returned to these lists that he had been working on at the age of 73 and published the Roget's Thesaurus. And until the age of 90, he kept refining it and working on it. But and so that's sort of an unfinished business, which is something I like. A lot of these stories are people, in a sense, returning to childhood in more obvious ways with Frank McCourt and Laura Ingalls Wilder, who brought us the Little House books, by writing about their quite literal childhoods. But then people like the concert pianist Ruth Slenczynska. As a child, she was called the Shirley Temple of classical music. And this is a woman who, at the age of 9, she had subbed for Rachmaninoff. Okay, and I interviewed her when she was 97 because she had an album come out. I interviewed her for CBS. But what I found was a woman who had been really tormented by her father as a child prodigy, and the piano was a punishment, and she was just so enormously talented, and he was brutal to her. She literally was not allowed to play with dolls or go outside and play with other kids. And much later in life, she returned to the piano on her own terms and learned to love it for the sake of itself. And I found that so beautiful.
I don't even know that there's no easy segue here, but the founding fathers of comedy. I mean, we have some guys who have been making us laugh for decades. Yeah. And I know some have passed away, and I think about Norman Lear. But you dig into what they've been doing.
Well, Norman Lear, Mel Brooks, and Carl Reiner, who were all good friends, and I got to know Norman moderately well. Yeah. I would say he was a friend by the end of his life. And together, when you think of their body of work, they are largely responsible for at least a big part of what we actually laugh at. I mean, Carl Reiner with the Dick Van Dyke Show really did help create the modern situation comedy. And then Norman Lear made sure that it actually said something. And this is an undeniably culturally Jewish thing, and that needs to be celebrated and acknowledged for what they did and what they have given us. So much of what we laugh at and think is funny comes from them. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. And Mel Brooks is still going. Mel Brooks is very different than the other two, because I think Mel Brooks, there was this a grumpiness about him. A lot of what drove him was anger at injustice, at the horrors of the Holocaust. I mean, making fun of Hitler, knocking him off his pedestal, was a real driving force of behind what Mel Brooks did.
Like so Producers, for example.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yep. Mm-hmm.
It's really remarkable.
Yeah.
We have to ask you about those who misspent their old age.
There's a whole chapter here about folks that some of whom are household names, some aren't, who misspent their old age. One of those, you argue, is Rudy Giuliani.
Rudy Giuliani, this chapter is comprised of people that you think all you had to do is do nothing. Just enjoy the laurels. Take those victory laps. Just, first, second, and finally, just do no harm. And Rudy Giuliani, there's certainly his mayoralty can be addressed, but I don't think it's debatable that the city was in key measures better off once he finished as mayor than it was at the beginning. I think when he became Person of the Year for Time, it wasn't just an acknowledgement for how he handled the aftermath of 9/11. I think it was also for how he had shown that a city could be governed, which is something that had been in some doubt, I think, that a city like New York could be governed. And then his behavior since then, and with the 2020 election and the Georgia election workers. And there's a reason he is bankrupt. I don't know if he's legally bankrupt. You can correct me on that if he's declared bankruptcy. But
there's a lot of stuff still going on in terms of his assets.
He really could have just done nothing and been okay.
How about, we've just got about a minute or so left here. I mean, going through this and all the reporting you've done as a journalist and these stories, does any of it make you think differently about how you want to live?
Yes. And I think this is happening anyway. One of the unexpected things of getting older, I'm 55 now, is that I'm actually, and I'm happy to report, fretting less about the future, which I think I didn't expect that to happen. I would think that the less time you have on the other side, the more you'd fret.
Yeah.
I'm not, and I think that that's a characteristic of a lot of these people. So I'm a little freer to act. And I think in a way, you might as well act now because people's memories are short. And when you're gone, your children, your loved ones will remember you, hopefully for at least a little bit of time. but you might as well act now, enjoy life, and be in the present because it goes by quickly.
No, you're right. Be in the present and don't be afraid to do new things, right? Even as you get older.
And I'm also trying to speak more deliberately in sentences that can be diagrammed instead of just run-on crazy sentences where I'm just filling space.
Before we let you go, capital of Slovenia?
Oh, Ljubljana?
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Just making sure.
That sounded like I made up a sound.
Just keeping you honest here.
We might be emailing you some more questions.
I was actually just slurring, but okay.
Mo Rocca, thank you so much. Inspiring and really thoughtful and just fun to read. Octogenarians with Jonathan Greenberg, late in life, debuts, comebacks, and triumphs. Thank you so much.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Business Week podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business App. Or watch us live on YouTube.
All right, Tim, we're going to continue with our summer reading list. This is our final pick number 6. And I got to say, for me, it was pretty easy. When we started talking about doing this project, I'm like, first of all, to be fair, we talked to a lot of great authors. Our producer, Paul Brennan, really books us with some really great guests, as you can see in the previous segments.
Yeah, but I think this one actually came courtesy of you, right?
No.
Maybe it was Paul. He realized you're a sailor.
He did.
He knows you're a sailor.
This was like a gift to me.
It was a gift to you. The book is just fantastic.
He gave the book to me early on. He's like, you got to look at this one. My husband and I are sailors. We have been for over 30 years. We love being out on the water with no one around us for what seems like miles. Or like last summer, we were pretty alone, only boat out there, except for Humpback, which popped up at our bow and then entertained us with breaches and tail smacks and like waving, one of his dorsal fins, or I forget what fin that is, off our stern for over an hour. It's pretty amazing. But I will say for the most part, when we are out sailing, we're in sight or just off the coast. The coastline and land is often in sight for us. We have not done serious offshore sailing across an ocean alone, something that we know many others have done.
Not yet, is what I say.
That's what my husband says, not yet.
Well, Richard King surely did. He's visiting professor in maritime history and literature with the Sea Education Association. He crossed the Atlantic in his 28-foot sloop he calls Fox. He wrote all about his treacherous journey in his new book. It's also Carol's pick, Sailing Alone, a surprising history of isolation and survival at sea.
I sailed by myself in 2007 across the Atlantic, and I definitely don't see myself as a super sailor. It was a little bit of a bungling affair, and in some ways, going out of sight of land, off the coast is easier, right? There's less to hit and less to keep track of. But I did it for a couple different reasons, and that was one of the things that I explore in this book. I'm really telling the history of people that have gone to sea by themselves and crossed oceans by themselves since at least the early 1700s. And all the way up to today. And so I was trying to explore, why did people go? Why would they go? And then also what they saw out there, just like you did in that intro, Carol, what is it like to be out at sea by yourself on a quiet boat, really close to the surface, day after day, and really getting that connection to the ocean world.
Well, and I love that, the book about, why they go, what they see. So when you took your trip across the Atlantic on Fox, your 28-foot sloop, why did you go specifically? And what did you see?
Yeah, I was in graduate school at the time, and I studied literature of the sea. I'm actually more of a scholar than, a sailor. And I'd spent so much time reading about these experiences. And I was like, maybe I could do that. And so I'm really proud of sort of the logistics of the voyage, not necessarily the execution, but I did make it. And, some of the things that I saw out there was just a really close connection with some of the seabirds, particularly storm petrels. Mm-hmm. I had one moment, which many of the listeners will sort of connect with, where I was fishing off the back of the boat and I saw a fin coming behind me, a really large dorsal fin. And I kind of freaked out. I was like, oh my gosh, Jaws is going to leap right on top of the boat and, eat me up. And, I quickly went down below and I took pictures and I grabbed my boat hook as if I was going to, stab it in the eye or something like that. And then later when I look at the pictures, I realized it was this tiny little fin. It probably wasn't even a shark. It might have been like a pilot whale or something. But, you just really get that sort of intense connection, particularly the nights at sea and the sunrises and sunsets. And it's a rare, privileged experience, really.
Maybe because I'm an anxious New Yorker, I'm just wondering about the anxiety of being out there.
It's so calm.
I know it's calm, but there's this feeling that I have. I'm not a sailor. I've sailed before, but I would not consider myself a sailor, of not being in control of when you can get back on land. And that part of this totally freaks me out here. Were there any moments out there that you just found yourself terrified?
Like when the engine died on that trip across the Atlantic?
Yeah, Tim, totally. I would say 90% of the time I was an anxious wreck, and my people are also from New York, so
Okay.
I have that strain.
Okay.
I think, and that's really, the book is really about some of these great sailors who have gotten over that first anxious experience. I kind of never did. I did my first trip across the Atlantic, and then afterwards I was like, okay, I think I'm good. But I do kind of wish that I had continued on, because you look at some of the really extraordinary historical sailors, Bernard Morticia, Robin Knox Johnson, Ellen MacArthur, even, the early ones like Joshua Slocum, who got over those initial anxious moments and then were able to carry on and really be calm and really enjoy themselves at sea. And often that's when, these sailors really got these experiences in the natural world where they could finally relax and not have to worry so much about, this thing breaking or
there's something always breaking on a boat. You know that.
Yeah.
It's always breaking. Well, what's the joke? They say it's like hours and hours of boredom broken up by, minutes or seconds of just sheer terror and chaos. And that's kind of sailing, right? Because it's really quiet out there. And then you have to go into harbor and you have to dock. And it's like there's always something that's going to go wrong.
That's right. And, for a big part for solo sailors, trying to steer the boat and trying to get rest is a big part of it. And so one of the things I talk about in the book is sort of the development of various technologies that have made it a little bit easier for solo sailors, whether it's GPS or fiberglass or the marine engine. But self-steering mechanisms, whether they're wind-based or electrical, have made a huge difference.
You had a wind...
but even in my case...
Did you have a wind vane? That's what you used, right, to go across?
That's right. I had two different types of steering. I had a wind vane self-steering, which doesn't require any power or any fuel, and that is about the most magical device on the planet. That was developed sort of in the 1950s and 60s for recreational boats, and that was just amazing. That's based on relative wind. So if you went to sleep for 2 hours and you got up, the boat is adjusting itself based on the angle of the wind. So if the wind shifts, your boat is going to change. And then I also had a little electrical tiller pilot, which you could set to a compass point.
I'm curious about the reasons behind this and how, not necessarily yours, which I want to get to, but the way that they've shifted over time. Because as you mentioned, in the 1700s, a lot of this was exploration. It was in search of riches. It was in search of, at that point, not necessarily new lands, but sort of, right? The great exploration of the seas and of the earth. But these days, a lot of it is about recreation and it's about sort of personal challenges. And I'm wondering how you can characterize the evolution of why someone would do this.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And that's certainly something I sort of trace through going over time, because, that the whole idea that going sailing by yourself across an ocean, that isn't completely just a bananas, idiotic kind of thing, that this idea that over time people started to respect that is a sort of interesting transition. And you do see sort of blips. Everybody is different and everybody's complex about whether they're escaping a family situation or they are trying to make money or they're trying to make fame for themselves. But you do see sort of these sort of blips of where there's more recreational sailing and then even more solo sailing. One of these blips is right after World War II. And I focus the book a lot, sort of frame it on Ann Davidson, who's the first woman that we know of to sail alone across an ocean. And she sails in 1952. And she's part of this whole surge of people from Europe, from North America, from all around the world that really are going out to the ocean and seeking that sort of respite, that sort of perception that the ocean is a clean, unhampered space, particularly after the trauma of World War II.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating, right, to kind of hear what they sought out, right, to help them through it.
I want to go back to something you said earlier, and that was, I think, the first solo circumnavigator, or who was actually, let me let you pick the story that you just were really drawn to, because there's older folks a long time ago. There's teenagers, which I'm always blown away by, someone who's a teenager who gets in a book and their parents are in a boat and their parents are like, yeah, go for it. I think about, there was a Netflix movie just on Jessica Watson, an Australian teenager, and it's kind of wild.
Yeah, Jessica Watson is fantastic. And I think one of the things that I talk a lot about in the book is this relationship between being a writer, because going to sea, maybe even for you, Carol, even when you go out just for an afternoon or for a day, it's a literary endeavor. You're keeping a logbook, maybe you're writing a note, you're writing a letter, you're reading about other sailors. And so it's this very sort of, almost all of these people that are going sailing alone are also thinking about it artistically, and some of them are thinking about writing a book even before they've left. And so someone like Bernard Martissier, who in the 1960s was the first to sail solo nonstop around the world, 1.5 times around the world in the late 60s. And for him, from the very start, it was about making a book, about crafting this work of nature writing, not even as much about the expedition itself. It was like as if Thoreau, was climbing Everest.
Just got about a minute left here. I mean, 30 years of sailing, we saw our first whale play with us in a boat off of Rhode Island just this past summer. And my husband and I looked at us, maybe it's time to sell the boat because it was just so unbelievable. But you have about a minute left here. Is there a moment in time where you just, I don't know, a little story before we go, unfortunately?
Sure. Yeah. I think one interesting story is, if you're watching in the news, you're seeing orcas that are damaging boats off Gibraltar that are actually seem to be knocking into recreational boats. And one thing that you learn from the history is that's been happening for a while. And one former New Yorker, Teddy Seymour, born in Yonkers, the first black sailor to sail alone around the world. And he was knocked by an orca off the Red Sea for about a half a day, but luckily just kind of banged into his self-steering gear. But he tells a great story of it.
I got to tell you, we watch the orca videos and we watch all these people, whether it's the YouTubers, Project Atticus or Vagabond, or, my husband and I are obsessed with it. And you get a feel of what it's like to be out on the ocean.
Professor, just 15 seconds left. Would you do it again?
I think I do it with friends.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what that's what most of them do. And some of them have a couple kids and they're going around the world, but they eventually on some of those big crossings bring friends on. This was so much fun. I hope we get a chance to talk again, and maybe you will buy. Do you have a boat now?
Don't. Yeah. If anyone would like to donate one, I'm available.
Well said. Well said. Richard King, his book is Sailing Alone, A Surprising History of Isolation and Survival at Sea, joining us from Santa Cruz, California. A great place to go sailing, no doubt about that.
Richard, visiting professor of maritime history and literature with the Sea Education Association.
This is the Bloomberg Business Week podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business App. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.